Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? 2 weeks from today, Americans will vote for their next president, and the whole world is watching. But elections in the US can be pretty confusing, so let's talk about it. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio, on and off since 2016. So in exactly 2 weeks, on November 5th, 2024, the US will hold their presidential election, which the whole country, and quite frankly, the entire world, is anxiously anticipating, and that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. But with a country as big as the US, reaching all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, with 330 million people and an election system that dates back more than 200 years, it can be really hard to keep track of how the election actually works, even for people who grew up here, but especially for foreigners like myself. You hear about the Electoral College, voter registration, swing states, how the popular vote doesn't reflect the actual outcome of the elections, the two-party system, and so much more. So let's break it down step by step and talk about how the American election system is set up, who Americans get to vote for on their ballot, and what makes this year's election so tense. I put all the timestamps for the different chapters in the video description below. This year, the presidential candidate for the Republican Party is, for the third time in a row, Donald Trump, a billionaire and media personality from New York who was already president from 2016 to 2020. His running mate for vice president is Senator James David Vance, short JD Vance, who actually grew up just half an hour north of Cincinnati in Middletown, Ohio. The candidate for the Democratic Party is current Vice President Kamala Harris from California, who's also a former senator and former Attorney General of California, and her running mate for vice president is Tim Walz, the current governor of Minnesota and a former member of the House of Representatives. As you probably all know, politics in the US have been very divided for a long time, but there are a few events that happened over the last 4 years that have made the situation even more tense. That includes the attack of the US Capitol on January 6th, 2021, when the 2020 election was being finalized, the war in Ukraine that started or escalated in 2022, the overturn of Roe v. Wade in June 2022, which has led to over 20 US states banning or heavily restricting abortion access, the Gaza war that escalated in October of 2023, Donald Trump being convicted on 34 felony counts earlier this year, and at least 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump that happened in the last few months. So it's been an intense 4 years politically, and a lot of these things have an impact on how people are going to vote. Additionally, according to this survey from July, some of the most important topics for voters this year are inflation and prices, immigration, healthcare, jobs and the economy, and abortion. What also stirred things up recently was when different celebrities shared with the public which candidate they're endorsing. Elon Musk has been very vocal about this, for example, Mark Cuban, Kid Rock, Billie Eilish, Julia Roberts. But recently, even Taylor Swift made a public announcement saying that she supports Kamala Harris, which made worldwide headlines for days, especially because Donald Trump had previously posted an AI-generated picture that made it look like Taylor Swift was endorsing him. One thing that's super important to keep in mind is that most of the news outlets here in the US have a pretty clear political bias and cater to specific audiences. And especially during an election year, that can create echo chambers and polarize the political climate even more. That's why I use Ground News, which is an app and website that breaks readers out of their echo chambers by showing how different outlets from across the world and across the political spectrum report on the same story. It's super helpful to get a better overview of all the different aspects and approaches there are to a topic. And Ground News also shows you where the respective outlet usually leans politically, who it's owned by, which might influence their agenda, and how factually accurate their reporting usually is. I also really appreciate the blind spot feed, and they now even made one specifically targeted towards election topics. This basically shows you the stories that were disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum and may have been a total blind spot for the other side. If we look at this story, for example, about Arizona letting voters decide about abortion access on the ballot, we can see that Ground News found over 100 different sources covering this topic, but only 7% of those were on the political right. Here you can compare the different headlines and narratives of the same story, like why Arizona Democrats are fired up over an abortion ballot initiative versus Arizona measure would make it a right to kill babies in abortions. I can also see that the majority of these outlets are considered highly credible, meaning their reporting tends to be more objective than subjective. Staying informed this way is really helpful to understand the different ideologies that can influence the way people think and vote. And as we're getting closer to election day, I think it's really important that people are actually informed about the issues they'll be voting on. So if you'd like to make sure you get the full picture and make informed decisions, I'd really recommend checking out Ground News, especially ahead of the elections in November. I even have their browser extension installed so that I can get a quick overview of these things even when I read a news story directly on a website. Just go to ground.news/Feli or scan my QR code to save 40% on the same unlimited access Vantage plan that I use to stay fully informed on elections, politics, and more. But let's take a step back and talk about how US elections even work. The United States of America is set up as a presidential system where the president is the most important politician in the country, since he or she is both the head of state and the head of government at the same time and is elected by the citizens of the country. For comparison, in Germany or the UK, for example, we have a parliamentary system where the voters elect the members of the parliament and the parliament then elects the head of government, who in Germany is called the chancellor. In the UK, they're called the prime minister. These people are not the head of state though, which is the most powerful politician in the country. In the UK, that would be the king. In Germany, that's our Bundespräsident. Both of them have a mostly representative function though. Since in the US the president is not elected by the parliament, aka Congress, the executive and the legislative branch of government are less intertwined, which can be an advantage because it means that the president isn't dependent on Congress to come into power. On the other hand, it can also make it difficult for the president to actually pass any new policies, because this can lead to situations where the party that the president belongs to doesn't have the majority in Congress. That's actually the case right now. The current president, Joe Biden, is a member of the Democratic Party, but the House of Representatives, so one of the two chambers of Congress, is currently controlled by the Republican Party. And they block a lot of the policies that President Biden and his party would like to implement. A few more hard facts. The president is elected every 4 years in the US, and every president can only be in office for a total of 2 terms, so 8 years max. In order to run for president, you have to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, so I wouldn't be eligible. You have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to have been a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. Election day is always on a Tuesday here in the US, on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November to be exact, which this year is November 5th. Now, in most countries around the world, elections are held on the weekend so that most people are off work and have time to go vote. In Germany, we always vote on a Sunday, for example. So why do Americans vote on a Tuesday? Isn't that super hard to coordinate with work and school? It is actually a real challenge for many people, but we have to remember that these rules have been in place since 1789, and back then, the idea was that voters could attend church on Sunday, then use Monday to travel to the polling location, which was often in a different town, and then they could be back by Wednesday, which was usually when the farmers would sell their produce at the market. So they did think this through back in the day, and then it was just never changed. Fortunately, many states today have rules in place that allow for employees to take some time off work that day, and more people choose to vote by mail, which makes the whole process a lot more flexible too. Now, we're currently in the final phase of the election craziness, but the candidates typically get nominated by their parties months before election day, after the so-called primary elections are completed. We're not going to get too much into detail about those, but they're basically elections where voters can decide which candidate should even run for the two parties. The rules and dates for the primary elections are different in every state. In some states, every registered voter can just go to their polling location and vote in the primaries. In other states, only only people who have a specific political party listed on their registration can vote, and then they can only vote for the candidate of that party. And then in some states, there are no real primary elections at all, and instead the parties hold these private caucuses where they vote for the candidates internally. This year, the first primaries were held in January. Then a lot of states had them on the same day in March, which is generally referred to as Super Tuesday, and the last ones were held in June. After that, the candidates officially get nominated at each party's national convention. The Republican convention took place in July this year in Milwaukee, where former President Donald Trump officially became the presidential candidate for the Republicans. Now, for the Democrats, it was current President Joe Biden who won the primaries, but he actually decided in July to no longer run for a second term, which was when Vice President Kamala Harris entered the race instead and was eventually nominated as the official presidential candidate for the Democrats at their national convention in August, which took place in Chicago. So she was nominated even though she wasn't elected in the primaries, which did lead to some complaints among voters, but it's not technically against the rules because the whole process of the primary elections isn't regulated in the Constitution, and it's not even legally required to hold primary elections. The campaigns of the candidates also typically start months, if not years, prior to Election Day. Donald Trump started his rallies back up in June of 2021, so only about 6 months after he left office. Joe Biden officially started campaigning in June of 2023. For comparison, in Germany, political campaigns for the federal elections only start about 6 weeks before Election Day. And with these major campaigns in the US, one crucial factor for the candidate's success is usually money, because these campaigns tend to cost millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, which is why most presidential candidates are already pretty wealthy when they decide to run or have been extremely successful at fundraising money. Political donations play a huge role in American election campaigns. Just to give you guys an idea of what type of numbers we're talking about here, Kamala Harris has raised over $1 billion so far, and she only entered the race in July. Part of these campaigns is also that if you live in the US, it's pretty common to receive lots of emails and even spam text messages asking for political donations. Those can be really funny, actually, and apparently they sent these to everyone because I'm not even eligible to vote in this country, nor have I ever made any type of political donation, yet I've received numerous texts from Kamala Harris herself, or Barack Obama, or President Joe Biden. Fellow YouTuber Evan Edinger, an American living in the UK, actually made a hilarious video about these email campaigns. I'll link that down below for you guys. What's also a big part of life in the US during an election year is political signs. People have them in their yards, on their cars, or even walk around in clothing that shows who they're voting for. That's definitely something I was not used to from Germany. In order to be eligible to vote in the presidential elections, you have to be a US citizen, be at least 18 years old, and you have to register to vote. That's an extra step that most other countries don't require. In Germany, as long as you're a citizen and of age, you can just show up to the polling location. Here in the US, all states except for North Dakota require their citizens to register in order to be able to vote. This can usually be done in person, by mail, or online, and it's basically just a form where you fill out your personal information, address so that they know where you'll be voting, and if you align yourself with one of the major parties or as politically independent. Now, there are actually some groups of American citizens who aren't eligible to vote, and that includes people who live in a US territory, such as Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, or American Samoa. And in most US states, that also includes people who are currently serving a prison sentence. And even after convicted felons have completed their time in prison and any potential parole or probation afterwards, a lot of states still don't allow them to vote, which is a rule that's been heavily criticized for years, and I can understand why. Now, once we finally made it through the primaries, all of the campaigning, we've registered to vote, it's finally time to fill out the ballot, which you can either do on Election Day at your local polling location, or you can vote by mail in advance. And on the ballot, you will see something like this, except that this year, of course, the top two options will be Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, or Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, as well as a few third-party and independent candidates. And even though it seems like you'll vote directly for the presidential candidate, that's not actually the case in the US, because the founding fathers of this country opted for an indirect voting system, mainly because they didn't really trust the general public to make informed decisions about candidates from other states. But they also didn't want Congress to elect the president, as is the case in modern-day Germany, in order to keep an even stronger separation of power between the legislative and the executive branch. And after months of looking for good solutions to the problem during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they eventually settled for the compromise of the Electoral College, even though nobody seemed to be fully happy with it.
Nobody really thought this was the best idea. to be honest with you, there was discussion of, well, it's not the greatest thing, but we can amend the Constitution, and we can change it. Let's give it a try.
The Electoral College is basically a replica of Congress, except that its only purpose is to elect the president. So each state gets the same amount of electors as they have members in the House of Representatives, plus 2 extra electors for the 2 senators per state. And since 1961, Washington, D.C. gets 3 electors of their own, even though they're not represented in Congress, which makes the total number of electors come down to 538. So instead of the American people voting for the US president directly, it's these 538 members of the Electoral College who come together every 4 years for the sole purpose of electing the president and vice president. In order to win the election, a candidate needs to receive the majority of the electoral votes, so 270 or more. Now, as I said, electors are divided by state, and each state gets a certain number of electors based on their representation in Congress, which is roughly supposed to be proportional to the state's population size. So California, with about 39 million residents, gets 54 votes in the Electoral College, while a smaller state like Vermont only gets 3. Now, just like many things in the US, even the actual voting system for federal elections isn't centralized, but varies from state to state, which is why each state gets to decide how their electoral votes work. And the vast majority of the 50 US states have opted for the winner takes it all system, meaning the candidate that gets the most votes in the state receives all of the state's electoral votes. So even though about 35% of Californians voted for Donald Trump in 2020, all of the state's electoral votes went to Joe Biden because he won the state, as they say. And the same thing happens vice versa, of course, like in Texas, where Joe Biden received 46%, so almost half of all votes, yet he didn't receive a single electoral vote from that state because they all go to the winner. The only states that divide their electoral votes are Maine and Nebraska. Biden received about 53% of votes in Maine, which granted him 3 electoral votes, and Trump got 44%, which granted him 1 electoral vote. In Nebraska, Trump received 58% for 4 electoral votes, while Biden got 39% for 1 electoral vote. So it's an attempt at being a little bit more proportional and representing the different opinions within the state, even though it's still definitely not fully proportional. By the way, the Republican Party recently tried to get Nebraska to change their system so that they give all electoral votes to just 1 candidate, but the state wasn't on board with that. This winner-takes-it-all concept is one of the major points of criticism of the Electoral College and the American voting system in general, because for millions of Americans, this basically means that even though they voted, their vote didn't actually count. Because if you voted for the Democrats in Texas, there wasn't a single electoral vote that went towards that candidate, which can be pretty frustrating. And that's not the only thing that's been heavily criticized about the system. I said earlier that the number of electors that each state gets is roughly supposed to be proportional to their population size, and the emphasis here is on roughly because there are major discrepancies between states. This graphic by Vox shows it pretty well. These numbers were from the 2020 election, they've changed a little since then, but the issue is still the same. So Texas at the time had about 25 million residents and 38 electoral votes. 25 million divided by 38 comes out to 664,000, which means that each of the electors represents about 664,000 voters. In a smaller state like Vermont, they have 3 electors for a total of 630,000 residents, which means that each elector represents only 210,000 people, which at the end of the day makes a vote in Vermont count more than 3 times as much as a vote in Texas. And shouldn't all all votes be equal? Here's another example that shows how a voter in Wyoming is even worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And it's similar for voters in the so-called swing states. They have way more influence on the election results than voters in other states. Swing states are states where Democrats and Republicans get a very similar amount of votes, so those states have been swinging back and forth between the two parties throughout elections. The list of states that are considered swing states has changed over time. Ohio used to be a swing state, for example, but has become more predominantly Republican over the last decade. Same goes for Florida. This year's swing states are Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. Those are going to be the states that will determine the final outcome of the election, because for the rest of the states, it's pretty clear which party they're going to go for. That's also why the presidential candidates put way more campaigning effort into swing states, and why most of their rallies take place in those states. According to this study from 2017, voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the outcome of the 2016 election as voters in Utah, for example. So again, the power isn't exactly distributed equally among all citizens. At the end of the day, this can even lead to scenarios where the outcome of the electoral votes doesn't align with the popular vote, aka the will of the American people. In 2016, for example, Hillary Clinton had received 48% of all votes, while Trump had only received 46%. But because of where the votes were placed, it transferred to only 227 electoral votes for Clinton, but 304 for Trump, which is why he ended up winning the election, even though the majority of Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. This was one of 5 cases throughout the history of this country that the popular vote did not match with who actually won the elections. The other times this happened were in 2000, when George W. Bush won, even though he actually received about 500,000 votes less than the Democratic candidate Al Gore. And the other times were over 100 years ago, in 1888, when Benjamin Harrison became president, 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes, and in 1824 with John Quincy Adams. If you've made it this far, you might be thinking, wow, this topic is super complicated, and in many ways, it seems unfair. And you're not alone with those thoughts. In fact, the majority of Americans would like to replace the Electoral College with the popular vote. The most current survey shows that 63% of Americans are in support of abolishing the Electoral College, and only 35% are for keeping it. And this isn't a new development by any means. The first attempt to change the system was as early as 1816, but it was blocked by senators from southern states. They had negotiated to have all of the enslaved people in their states each count as 3/5 of a person, rather than not counting them at all, in order to get more electors than the northern states, who didn't have nearly as many slaves. So keeping the system was profitable to them. Since then, there have been over 700 proposals to reform or eliminate the Electoral College, but they never reached the thresholds necessary to amend the Constitution. In 1969, there was a proposal that even passed the House and had support in both parties, but eventually it was again blocked by Southern senators. By the way, if you're wondering who elects the electors, again, the rules for this vary from state to state, but in most cases, it's up to the political parties to pick their electors. This often happens at state party conventions. So both parties have a set of electors picked, and the party that wins the state gets to send their electors. Most electors are politicians in one way or another. Oftentimes, they're members of the state or local governments or party leaders. Here's the Ohio list from 2020, for example. The only requirements according to the Constitution are that they can't be a member of Congress, hold a federal office, and it can't be someone who has, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or given aid or comfort to its enemies. Now, technically, electors aren't required to vote for the candidates who won the popular vote in their state, but it's super rare that an elector chooses to become what's called a faithless elector and vote against their state's will. The most faithless electors in recent history happened in the 2016 election, when 7 of the over 500 electors went with a different candidate. But so far, this has never changed the outcome of an election. Also, more than half of states actually have laws in place to punish faithless electors, either with fines or even with criminal charges. Now, one thing that really stands out in American politics is that it's only ever Republicans or Democrats. Those are the only two options. Welcome to the two-party system. Well, technically there are other parties, such as the Libertarian Party or the Green Party, and presidential candidates can also run independently if they want to. So the options are there, but if we look at the numbers, they barely ever get any votes. The main reason is that most people feel like they wasted their vote if they use it towards a candidate who they already know has no chance of getting the most votes in their state. Because as we know, that's the only candidate that will receive any of the electoral votes at the end. That's the presidential election. But what plays an even bigger role in the development of the two-party system is that the House of Representatives, so the legislature, also uses the winner-takes-it-all system. The 435 members of the House are all elected in single-member districts. The state of Ohio has 15 districts, for example, and for each of them, there will be one House representative, and it'll be the one that gets the most votes in that district. So even in the legislature, there's no proportional representation. If it were proportional, that would mean that if 10% of Ohio's votes go towards a third party, that party would receive 10% of Ohio's seats in the House. But that's not the case. Instead, if you vote for a third-party candidate, but they don't end up winning your district, your vote won't be represented in the House at all, which is why the House of Representatives looks like this and really only has Democratic and Republican members. Out of 435 total members, only 4 are currently independent, 2 of which were elected as Democrats and then switched to independent later on. So the system basically discourages people to vote for smaller candidates and parties that don't stand a chance of winning. And vice versa, if we look at how the political parties are set up, it seems like this is also the reason why in the US, political ideologies that in other countries would be split into several more nuanced parties have all been combined into these two major parties, because only then do they even stand a chance in getting the majority of votes. Another issue about the congressional districts that are used in the elections of the House is gerrymandering, where the outlines of the districts are changed in order to benefit the party in power. But we're not going to get into that right now. Instead, I'll link a great video by Vox in the description below. Speaking of the legislature, what isn't talked about quite as much as the presidential race is that on election day, Americans will also re-elect the entire House of Representatives, since they're only elected for 2-year terms. That's why there will be another election for the House in 2026 called the midterms. In some parts of the US, voters will also be electing a senator who have a 6-year term. This year, 33 out of the 100 seats in the US Senate are up for election. In addition to that, there are also state and local elections on the ballot in some places, as well as measures, so specific legislature that people can vote yes or no on. So your ballot will look completely different depending on the state and district you live in. One thing that was a little odd to me at first as a German was that people here also get to elect certain members of the judiciary branch, such as the Attorney General or certain judges. That's not the case in Germany, but maybe you guys can let me know in the comments below why that's the case here. If you're curious about how elections work in Germany, I have a whole video about that as well. I'll link that down below for you. But let's get into the most important questions here. How do you feel about the American election system? And what are your predictions as to who's gonna win this year? Put it in the comments below. And of course, there are also many things that I didn't get to touch on in this video because I didn't want it to be even longer than it already is. But feel free to add any additional information in the comments as well. Please just remember to stay respectful and civilized in the comment section. If you enjoy the content here on my channel, be sure to subscribe for free, activate the notifications, and you can also follow me on my other social media platforms. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed the video. And with that, I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!